I think this was very significant in my life where I realized I was an alcoholic, was when I knew either I would die drinking or I would get help. But that moment was when I was on an airplane after I had relapsed, and I told myself, well, I'm going to prove to the world that I'm not an alcoholic by only having 3 drinks. And I only did have 3 drinks. But after those 3 drinks, I realized I wanted more. And the only reason I wasn't having more than 3 is to prove everyone out there that I was not an alcoholic. And so in my head, I knew that if I really wanted to prove to everyone that I was an alcoholic, then I would spend my life always controlling something that I couldn't control. And so that was the first wake-up call. But after that, I relapsed. I went on a really rough bender. And at the time, I had a choice. And it was either I have to do this for myself, because the last time I had done it for my boyfriend and my mother, but someone at the rehab told me, Justine, you could have everyone love you, but if you don't love yourself, you'll never be happy.
Have you ever thought about your meaning of life?
What is our purpose here? You're listening to CatharSIS, a podcast about the meaning of life, created by 2 sisters who are in the field of marriage and family therapy.
Hello, my name is Michal.
And I'm Maayan.
This podcast was created in honor of our dad, who was a hematologist-oncologist, a medical doctor who would always ask everyone and anyone, what is the meaning of life?
It's a personal yet relatable podcast where we interview people and have discussions about the meaning of life, of course, as well as friendships, relationships, love, nostalgia, how to cope with an existential crisis, and normalizing grief and death. Okay, hello everybody. We have a very special guest with us today. Her name is Justine, and she happened to rescue a baby squirrel today. So she is actually holding a baby squirrel right now, right in front of us.
We will include pictures
Yes.
of this baby squirrel because it is so adorable. Is it a he or a she? Do you know?
It is a she. We looked underneath her.
So, Justine, thank you so much for joining our podcast today. We want to ask you the first question. How do we know each other?
So I'm actually joined at the hip with Maayan. No, I'm kidding. But to backtrack, actually, me and Maayan went to a graduate program together. We did our master's together. However, we also interviewed, and I think that's when we knew we would become good friends, because not only did she actually study in the town that I studied in the Netherlands, which is a very small town compared to the whole of Europe, but she also had some experiences in her personal relationships where she was going through handling someone who had addiction, and I myself had been through that process. So that's how we created a bond, and ever since, she's been one of my best friends.
Yeah, I met Justine in our marriage and family therapy program, which leads me to my next question, Justine. What drew you to the field of marriage and family therapy?
I won't say that it was something I knew my whole life, because I think a lot of my life I was pretty lost about what I wanted to do, especially going through my own addiction. But I think after going through that process and kind of working in the recovery world, I realized that I really wanted to help people, and I didn't exactly know how. And I knew that I didn't want to be limited by the substance abuse world. So at the time, I had some people around me who were like, why don't you just try? And at that moment, I didn't know that was my calling. I was interested in psychology, but I didn't know if I'd be good at it or not. And being that I failed a lot of times in my life, I didn't even think I'd get in, but I got in. And I think that experience itself really showed me how I could help people in a way that I had never known how to before. And yeah, that kind of sparked it. And from then on, it just became something that was a part of me that changed the way I view the world, that changed how I viewed myself. And I never regretted it.
What were you doing before you came to marriage and family therapy?
I actually was studying in Maastricht, where I met Maayan and I was studying arts and culture. Like, I was always very interested in kind of history and the social aspect of things. But when I hit my addiction, I wasn't doing much but using. And I think that in itself, when I got sober, gave me another perspective of like, how do I get better, or how can I get better, or how can I help people to get better? And so that drew me into that direction, I think.
What has your experience been like with addiction? And if you don't mind telling a little bit more about how did it start?
I think over time, my understanding of myself and addiction has grown. I think in the beginning, it was very limited to the 12 steps. I won't go into that because I don't think this is what this podcast is about. But I mean, when I was in my addiction, I didn't have any knowledge of what it was. My reference to addiction was what I saw in the movies and what I saw on the streets. I never thought that something like that could happen to me. And being that both my parents drank quite a lot, I'm not going to say they were alcoholics because that's something I don't believe anyone should diagnose except themselves. But they did drink quite a bit. And I think growing up and watching them drink every night after they came home, or even my dad's case, who drank more severely, I thought that was normal. So in my head, I kind of grew up with the narrative that, you know, I was going to grow up and this was a way to cope with life and that would be fine. What I didn't know is that my reaction to alcohol would be very different and very severe, to the point where I couldn't control it. My hangovers weren't even physical anymore. They were mental. I felt like I was psychotic all the time and I couldn't stop. And it was almost, it felt like being in a mental jail that I couldn't get out of because I needed a substance to not even get high at the end of the day, but just to make me feel better.
So was there something that happened that, I don't know, was there one thing that happened? Were there a few things that happened that made you realize, all right, I need to change my ways a little bit?
Yeah, I wouldn't even say it was me really, because I did not want to get sober in any shape or form. But there were certain events, for example, I'm grateful for it now, even though it sounds harsh. I think sometimes for me personally, I needed that, because if not, then I would have continued doing what I was doing. But at the time I was living with my boyfriend in Germany, and he was fed up with me because I was lying, I was drinking, I was using, I was not myself, and he kicked me out. And so my mom had to take me in, and my mom didn't know how bad my problem was until I went to the eye doctor, and she had asked me, like, how much do you drink? And of course I lied, but she could smell it on me because I was drunk. And she basically told me, well, if you don't stop, you're going to go blind. And being in the distorted mindset I thought I deserved it. And that didn't even get me sober. But at the time, my mom kind of tricked me and took me to a detox. And after the detox, she told me, she said, you're not coming home. So in my head, I thought, okay, I'm going to learn how to manage my drinking and using, which was not what recovery was about. And the first time I went to rehab, I honestly didn't understand what recovery was. It was only until I relapsed. And I remember the moment, I think this was very significant in my life, where I realized I was an alcoholic, was when I knew either I would die drinking or I would get help. But that moment was when I was on an airplane after I had relapsed. And I told myself, well, I'm going to prove to the world that I'm not an alcoholic by only having 3 drinks. And I only did have 3 drinks. But after those 3 drinks, I realized I wanted more. And the only reason I wasn't having more than 3 is to prove everyone out there that I was not an alcoholic. And so in my head, I knew that I would either have to, if I really wanted to prove to everyone that I was an alcoholic, then I would spend my life in this kind of mindset of always controlling something that I couldn't control. And so that was the first wake-up call. But after that, I relapsed. I went on a really rough bender, and eventually he kicked me out again. And then my mom this time put an even harder boundary where she said, you're not coming home until you get better. And at the time I had a choice, and it was either I have to do this for myself, because the last time I had done it for my boyfriend and my mother, but this time I realized it didn't matter how long that I needed the help, because the alternative was unrealistic. And it was one of the hardest decisions I had to make, because I really wanted to leave the rehab. For 2 days. I constantly was in a fantasy world thinking, oh, someone's going to rescue me, this, and this. But someone at the rehab told me, she said, Justine, you could have everyone love you, but if you don't love yourself, you'll never be happy. And I think somehow that clicked in my head, which made me surrender to the idea of I really need help and I need to do this.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing and for being so vulnerable with us. And how many years, can you tell the listeners how many years sober you are?
Yeah, of course. I got sober July 21st, 2014. So I have a tiny bit over 6 years.
Amazing. What would you say the hardest part of sobriety has been?
I mean, I think it changes over time. I think in the beginning, it's really about learning how to live without the substance because you're so dependent on it. But I think after that, the hardest thing is honestly just to feel your feelings, to not have that outlet of, oh, I'm going to have a drink to loosen up, because I will not just have one drink, or I'm going to smoke a joint and feel better for the night. I always end up in some sort of misery that I didn't plan on doing. So it's always when the really extreme emotions come where it's really hard to just sit through, because there's nothing you can do but just to feel it and go through it.
Yeah, that's so true. And I love what you said earlier too, how part of your wake-up call was, that realization of, and you can have love from everyone, but if you don't love yourself, then you're never gonna feel it. You're never gonna feel better. You're never gonna feel enough. And actually, that's one of the pieces of this podcast, I think, kind of one of our intentions behind this podcast and the meaning of life and all of that is, what does it mean to need to see oneself, to need validation from others, but what about that need for validation from ourselves, really? And I think that that's what you can also describe it as. You need to love yourself.
It's not an easy journey.
No, it sometimes can be a lifelong process.
Yeah. So you were mentioning your boyfriend from Germany, and what's it like being in a long distance relationship?
It's not easy. Mm-hmm. It's been rough. We've been through a lot of stages in our relationship, and I don't know, I feel like a lot of people try to give you tips or secrets, but I feel like every relationship is individual in its way, and there's no secret to it. It's been difficult. It's not an easy relationship. I love him, mm-hmm. but it's been up and down, not in the sense of when you hear toxic relationships up and down, but in terms of we've changed throughout our relationship. I got sober. He got a job. We had to do long distance. I failed in life. He's failed. Our cultural differences are very different. But I think at the end of the day, it's this willingness to want to work together, which makes it work. And the idea of compromise when it comes to, because we don't always understand each other and it can be very difficult, but mm-hmm. the willingness to want to work together to make it work.
Yeah. And is he planning on moving here at some point? Are you there or?
Yeah, it's in the works. We're just being patient right now just because of everything that's going on with the pandemic right. and whatnot. So it has been a rough year. I didn't see him for almost 8 months. And that was really difficult for our relationship because I felt like when you don't see someone for a long time and you're engaging in conversation when you're not even on the same schedule can be very conflictual, especially when little things bother you and you're fighting about things that you're not even actually fighting about, but you miss the person, can be very difficult for a relationship.
Yeah. Do you know any other people who are in a long distance relationship and have been affected by the pandemic? They can't visit their loved one?
Kind of. So I had a friend that I made. Maayan's met her. Her name is Sam. And she had a really horrible time during the pandemic because basically what happened was that her husband had basically been denied a green card. So they had to move to France automatically during the pandemic where she had to get a passport and that didn't come till June. So basically he left first and she had no idea when she was going to get her passport. And they had never done long distance, but they were kind of being coerced into this situation where they, first of all, they had to make a huge decision to up and leave because her husband was denied. And second of all, this process of, can we be together? How long will it take? So that friendship was very pivotal at the time that it came, because it helped me use my own experience to help her. And now they're together, which I'm really happy about. But those few months were really hard on them.
Relationships are hard as it is, but it's great that you guys are making it work. And I agree with that. It's about wanting to make it work. That's how you can make it work. It's about that commitment. It's about trying hard, working hard for the relationship.
Yeah, and I think something important is also the ability to be honest. I mean, we have been through a lot of things. We went through an open relationship. We've gone through a lot of things. And at the end of the day, I think it's important to be able to communicate where you are. Being in this culture, kind of, we tend to demonize, say, oh, that guy thought that girl was attractive, or this happened. And in all honesty, like, that's part of human nature sometimes, and it has to be discussed if it makes you uncomfortable, and not in the way that it's presented in kind of the paradigm where we're living in of, oh, he did this, he's a fool, or he doesn't deserve you. I think we each have flaws and positive things about us, and it's about being able to be yourself and not have these expectations on your partner where they can't be human.
That's so beautiful. And I mean, I just think it's incredible how you've sustained the relationship through so much. We've
broken up, so we're not perfect. Right. We've broken up a few times, and yeah, I mean, it is beautiful. I'd say it's hard work. I don't necessarily see it as beautiful just because I'm in it.
Right. I mean, regardless of, the ups and downs that you mentioned, if you look at it globally, if you look at the bigger picture, and it's just, as someone who is, an observer, I guess, or you've been through so much since 2014, or even before that. I'm assuming it's even before that.
Yeah, I wouldn't say I've gone through anything more than anyone else. I think we've all gone through our experiences that have shaped us to who we are. But yes, there have been definitely pivotal experiences in my life. For example, my father died when I was 12, which is something I'm still working on. My second mother died when I was basically 22. It's been a lot.
And how do you cope with everything now?
That's a difficult question. I don't think there's one form of way I cope. I think it's more of the values I choose to live by in order to continue. I think, for example, recovery gave me the ability to want to continue living. And in order to do that, I have to go through some pain. And there's happy times too, but to always remember that one of the purposes in life is to expand your whole, your authenticity, who you are, and to be able to grow into that person that you want to be. And in order to do that, I feel that you have to do work on yourself. You have to look inside. It's not a thing of, and I understand how important material things can be, of like having a job or supporting yourself and supporting your family. But I also think it's extremely important to work on the inside as well.
Absolutely.
What ignited the fire to really start this podcast was, as you know, our dad died recently.
Yes, I met him. I'm very honored to have actually met him.
Yeah, I feel honored as well. As difficult as he was, he had his moments, but no, he really was a very smart man, and he would always ask, what is the meaning of life? And always wanted to dig deeper. He wanted to know what keeps you up at night, and that was the first question he wanted to know about you and about the general people. And I don't wish this upon anybody, and it's weird that your dad also passed, and at the same time I found so much comfort in you because you went through that experience of losing a parent. And I think that's like a loss that's very hard to go through, and the fact that you went through that at such a young age, at 12, I want to know more. I know you were only 12, but how was that whole experience, and what is, this is a podcast about normalizing death. What is your perception about death? I'm curious about that.
I think to your first question, I didn't handle it well. I think I'm still handling it in a way. Let me put it this way. I think in society, we have a certain way of handling grief, and I don't think that was my way of handling it. So for a long time, I judged myself. For example, when my dad died, I never cried, or I didn't know how to handle it. I remember at the time my father's personality had shifted a lot because of him being sick, and me being a 12-year-old, I really didn't understand that. So it caused a lot of conflict between me and him. And when he died, I don't think I did this consciously, but subconsciously, I decided to fill my life with chaos, drama, boys, everything that was not about that. And I think ever since then, my way of dealing with death has been sort of that way. And I think I've told you, Maayan, I think when my dad died, and I don't judge her for saying this because I think it can be a healthy way of dealing with death. But I remember when my father dying and my mom saying, well, why are you sad? He's the one who's at peace now. You have to live. And I think in some way that has stuck with me, just because I understand living is very difficult, especially, and I'm talking about someone who has her needs met, and I find it difficult. I can't even imagine how difficult it is for other people in this world. Yeah. And I don't mean that in a privileged way. I mean that in all honesty of life is hard. And in terms of your second question, I think my idea of death has evolved over the time. I remember when I was a very little girl, I used to be very scared of death, but not scared of death in the way where I would say in the conventional way of death itself. I think I had this fundamental fear of, I had these memories of me being a little girl and almost dying, and then being in a coffin and not being able to come out, and me suffocating, or this idea of, I don't even believe in reincarnation, but I think aspects of it are embedded in my mind of kind of, well, what if I don't live this life to the fullest? And what if reincarnation exists and I come back as, say, the reason I use this group is because I am a huge advocate for them, but say a sex traffic victim. And the worst fear is not that, though. The worst fear is understanding what my last life was, and now being in a situation where I knew I could have done more or done better in the past life, and that I can't do anything now. And on top of that, I'm suffering. That's the fear. It's not so much of death itself. I would like to believe, and I try to believe that, I do believe it for other people. For some reason, it doesn't apply to me. And I don't mean that in a selfish way. I just think when I've experienced people dying in my close personal life, I choose to believe that they're at peace. I don't necessarily think it's a better place, but like I said, life can be very hard. I choose to believe they're at peace, but there's some part of me that's afraid that there's not going to be peace. And that is scary to me.
And how would you say you grapple with that piece, if at all?
I'm in therapy.
Well,
I think our fears about death are sometimes very intertwined with the ideas of how we see the world. Yeah. And lately in therapy, I've been working on this pattern of mine. I would say, as open as I am intellectually, I think I have a very hard time being vulnerable emotionally. And from the therapists I have seen, I think there is an aspect to me that, for example, when that death happened at the time, subconsciously, I made the decision to choose the more surface feelings. For example, romantic relationships, I could cry all day, but when it comes to something as serious as death, I'm somehow detached from it. And I think right now I'm kind of working on trying to feel those feelings again, or not even with death, but those feelings that I've just suppressed so hard. Mm-hmm. And there's a fear to that because I don't know what could come out. But at the same time, I don't want to continue not being able to be vulnerable, because I don't think for me it's a choice of being able to be vulnerable or not. I think it's autopilot of, oh, okay, this is happening. This is your go-to. And it's no longer a choice for me.
You sound so grounded in your answers. And I'm wondering, as I'm listening to you talk, how would you define your personal meaning of life? Looking back at everything you've gone through, everything you've lived through, and where you're standing now, if you could find glimpses or themes of meaning that have stuck out, what would you say is your definition of the meaning of life or your meaning of life?
I think part of it for me lately, or what I've been able to verbalize, is first being able to integrate all parts of myself. I think there are some parts of me that are still very fragmented that I don't necessarily understand. And I think one part of life is being able to integrate all those pieces of yours, which, whether they be emotional, external, or anything, but to be able to understand yourself as a whole, rather than, there are moments even now in my life where I feel like one part of me is taking over and I don't understand, or another part that I fear, and I don't want to fear myself. So that's definitely one. I think another reason for the meaning of life for me is to find purpose. I think purpose can change over time, and not only a surface purpose and I understand that money is very important in our society and everything, but I think for me, there's a much more deeper meaning to life and an existential meaning of life that we each go through, and each of our purposes are different, but that it's important that we look for it. And then the last one, I think, is to be a good person, to help others on your path, not because of karma or anything, but what is it to be human? We survive in communities, and to be able to communicate with someone and connect with someone. So I'd say basically connection, purpose, and integration for me.
I love that, Justine.
Connection, purpose, and integration.
I think that is my meaning too.
Me too.
Justine, I'm like so happy that you agreed to come on here, just because I love having conversations with you. I'm so intellectually stimulated by our conversations all the time. And you have such a way with words. You have such a way of conceptualizing the world around us and the world around you. And it's amazing. And I love being a witness to your experience. And I'm curious what your opinion is. How do you think healing happens?
That's a difficult question, because I think at different times in our life, healing can look very different. For example, how I healed in my sobriety is not how I heal today. And I think it always goes back to going inwards and to understanding what you lack or fail to understand about yourself or about other people. And the context can be different, but I think understanding ourselves in a systemic context externally and in a systemic context internally helps. And I think with each challenge that is brought into your life, it will require a new part of you. It requires you to access a new part of who you are, and to understand that it will be painful and you will judge yourself, but it's important to understand that that's not the end, because I get stuck in the judging myself so many times. Like you said earlier, I appreciate your friendship so much too, because I don't feel comfortable disclosing everything about myself with people. I think you know that. I'm a very outspoken person, but when it comes to the personal details of my life, I don't like to compare myself, and I don't want anyone else to think that my opinion is better. So it can be difficult for me to open up. So I appreciate you giving me that space as well.
And how amazing that you agreed to come on our podcast, given that.
And be vulnerable with us and our listeners. What you were saying about healing really does make sense. And something I tell friends, family, clients, I say is there's no avoiding grief. You can't push it away. You can't get rid of it. You can only learn how to cope with it. You learn to live with it. And I personally believe, I'm not the expert. I'm just, curious like the fellow human. But I personally believe that healing happens at the same time as learning to live with big, heavy emotions like grief and loss. Like, you learn to live with it, and that's when the healing takes place. But what do I know?
A lot. You know quite a lot.
I think you know a lot. I think no one's an expert on grief. Even if there's theories about grief, we each have our own experience, and we all go through it different ways. There's no one way to grief. And I think because there are so many dominant narratives in our society, we think, oh, we need to do this. We should feel like this. And I think one of the biggest lessons is learning not to do it like that.
Meeting yourself where you're at, I think, can be that in itself can be so challenging to even get to that place. Yeah. And I know from experience that coming to that place it's such a burden off the shoulders when you're really able to just meet yourself where you're at with every part. I call how you were describing it, I call it a mosaic. It's like I like to look at it. I like visuals. So I look at a mosaic of, okay, that's the part of me that needs attention right now. Or that's the part of me that didn't get heard when she was 14 and she wants to be heard right now. So give her that microphone, and it's interesting to hear you talk about that, the parts work.
Yeah, it's interesting what came to mind when you kind of said that with the mosaic, because I would say the way I experience grief has almost been shame. And that's a huge part of what I work through in therapy. I think I tend to be very shame-based, and I've never seen it like this before, but I do think the way I have grieved in the past is by shaming myself for the actions I've done. And unlearning that is very difficult. There's a lot of times where I still am in my head and thinking I'm a bad person because I didn't do this or I didn't deal with something a certain way. And I'm 29 and I still am in that. So yeah, it definitely is a lifelong process.
When you do get into that headspace, do you have any tools that you turn to, or is it just kind of like a natural process that goes on where you come to a place of like, okay, I'm going to be kinder right now. I'm going to be kinder. Or how does that unfold for you?
It varies, I think, depending on what it is, because I think my mind is still very conditioned to be able to self-condemn myself. So there are times where my brain will just keep going and I just have to ride it out because there's not always a solution. Right. And there's other times where, say, Maayan's there and I just spit it out, and what she says to me really resonates with me and helps me. Sometimes I wait till I have therapy. Sometimes I write it down. I don't think there's one specific way, because shame is a part of me too. And it's about learning how to make it into a part of me that I can almost be friends with, which I'm not there yet. I hate it when I'm in that space. But I also know, I think an awareness of that is very important, because it's not going to go away. Mm-hmm. It's there. It's a part of me. I know it's a part of me. And I think for a long time, I didn't want it to be a part of me. Yeah. But yeah, I know I didn't really answer your question, but I don't feel like there's one way to heal. No. And there's no linear way of healing.
Absolutely. You're reminding me, one of my meditation teachers, her name is Heather. And when I was training to get certified to teach meditation, we were like in these intense meditation classes every weekend. And one of the things she taught me, was when that shame comes up, whether it's shame, whether it's anxiety, anything that, it was like this general concept, but I worked with the shame piece. And she said, anytime that comes up, it's a reminder of like, hello, you're here. And this is in the context of meditation, but it's like, hello, you're here and I see you. What do you want to say? And just hello, I'm here, and it's like I'm talking to the shame piece or the anxious piece or whatever it is. I'm here. What do you want to say? It seems kind of simple. Oh, okay. But to actually go through that exercise, it was so tender. It was so deep. It was so nourishing, just to give that piece of voice and to allow my bigger part to give that piece of voice, even if it was just a 2-minute experience, So I would agree with you that there isn't just one way. And I think it's so important to have many tools, whether it's talking to a friend, journaling,
It also reminds me of, the Gottmans. They are relationship experts, and they talk about when you're in a relationship, it's not how you're good that matters. It's how you are in conflict. And I say this to clients. How do you manage conflict with yourself? Conflict with yourself is something you can't avoid. So it's how you manage it that can determine the healthy relationship you have with yourself. And that applies to also a relationship with the external as well. The external and the internal, how you manage conflict. I really think a lot about conflict and conflict management. And for Michal, for my sister, she talks to herself through meditation. And what do? I journal, and I tell the whole world I'm angry. I'm feeling angry and irritated. And I go outside and look at nature, and I don't know. And we all kind of just do what we need to do to manage the conflict within ourselves. We can't avoid those negative emotions with ourselves or with others. I want to thank you so much, Justine, for your time.
Me too. What an incredible way to get to know you better.
Yeah, I feel like we've met a couple times, but not in depth. But I think we definitely met tonight.
One of the nourishing parts about being part of this podcast is if there's one takeaway I can leave with this podcast idea is getting to just be real with people and, in a way that is comfortable and
hearing their story.
Just hearing their story, but also you verbalizing your story and the audience listening to your story. And I mean, so many people listening 100% can relate to at least one thing that you shared.
Is there a way that listeners can reach you if they wanted to reach you?
My handle is actually existential world problems. So
love it.
It's a theme.
Perfect.
Thank you for tuning in to CatharSIS. We hope that you enjoyed today's episode with Justine, and we'll see you next time.
In a world where I'm a drop in the ocean, an Israeli, American, whatever, in France, to be completely happy and satisfied in my environment, all I need is one friend. 2 friends, it's a luxury. Okay, the ultimate friend is the one you open up your soul to, the one you share with, the one who actually gives you the full reaffirmation that you thirst for. Mm-hmm. Okay, we all do that. Okay, we all have the thirst for reaffirmation.